The grand halls of the federal courthouse were alive with a vitality that hadn't been felt in years. Protesters lined the sidewalks, half chanting in support of AOC, the other half demanding her imprisonment. Inside, journalists lined the seats, notepads ready, cameras rolling. This wasn't just a trial, it was political theater at its highest level. AOC stepped out of the black SUV, her expression unreadable. Washington, D.C. had seen its fair share of political scandals, corruption, and bribery cover-ups, but this was different. She was dressed in a sleek navy blazer and looked every bit the fighter her supporters thought she was. But this time, the fight took place in a court of law rather than Congress. At the prosecution's table, Pam Bondi, the tenacious former Attorney General, who is now a federal prosecutor, was seated next to her. Karoline Leavitt, a rising star in conservative media, was tasked with guiding the narrative in Bondi's favor, while Bondi was getting ready for battle. In the courtroom, Leavitt made sure that public opinion was already tilting against AOC. The Sutter judge entered an older man who was known for his impartiality, but had little patience for political theater. He tapped his gavel and said, "Court is now in session." Charges Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez with obstruction of justice and conspiracy to help people evade federal law enforcement. The evidence will show that the defendant did not just support immigration reform. She actively encouraged illegal immigrants to disobey lawful orders and avoid deportation. A murmur went through the gallery, and Bondi went on, "This is not a case about politics. This is a case about the law. No one is above it, not a senator, a congresswoman, or even a self-proclaimed champion of justice." The tension in the room increased as AOC's lawyer, James Calloway, took her seat. In contrast to Bondi's sharp delivery, his voice was steady and controlled. "Ladies and gentlemen, the prosecution will attempt to convince you that my client is a criminal who is standing up for people's rights. Rights is a crime, but let's be clear, what Representative Ocasio-Cortez did was inform people about their constitutional protections. That is not obstruction. That is democracy." He then turned to the jury. If the government can prosecute someone for educating people about their rights, where does that end? Will lawyers be arrested for advising their clients? Will journalists be imprisoned for reporting on constitutional protections? Today, you are not just deciding the fate of my client. You are deciding the limits of free speech itself. He went back to his seat, exhaling slowly. The judge surveyed the room, and the prosecution may call its first witness Bondi. The government calls Special Agent Daniel Briggs. A tall, broad-shouldered man in an ICE uniform walked to the stand, took the oath, deliberate his motions, and his expression, unreadable. Agent Briggs Bondi started, "Can you explain your role in immigration enforcement?" Briggs nodded. "I oversee operations targeting high-priority deportation cases. My unit specializes in locating individuals who have outstanding removal orders." Bondi walked to the evidence table and lifted a thick folder. "Were you involved in any operations that were directly impacted by the defendant's actions?" Bondi said. "Yes," he said. "During a raid targeting a known felon with an active deportation order, our agents arrived at his residence. We had confirmation that he was inside, but he refused to open the door. Instead, he was seen reading from a document." Bondi turned to the jury. "And what was this document?" It was a step-by-step guide on how to avoid ICE. Rights pamphlet sent through Representative Ocasio-Cortez's office. A hush fell over the room. Bondi went on. "You're telling this court that the defendant's materials directly led to a target evading federal authorities?" "Yes," Briggs confirmed, "but not just that night. Since her materials started circulating, we've seen a measurable increase in resistance during enforcement operations," Bondi said, letting the words settle before continuing. No more questions were asked. Calloway rose without incident. "Agent Briggs, you've worked in law enforcement for how many years?" Briggs replied. "And in those 15 years, are you aware that the Fourth Amendment protects people from unlawful searches and seizures?" Bondi nodded. Briggs hesitated. "Yes, Yes. Calloway moved in closer. Did your crew obtain a court order to enter the house? No, Briggs said, his mouth clenched. That was an administrative order. The person in question exercised his legal right to deny entry to law enforcement without a judicial warrant. So let's be clear. Is that right? Briggs hesitated again. Technically, yes. Calloway turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, the government wants you to think that my client obstructed justice, but in reality, she just told people the truth. Law enforcement cannot enter your property without a judicial warrant. The first battle had not gone entirely in her favor, but she was far from done. Judge Whitaker tapped his gavel and said, "We will recess for lunch. Court will resume in 1 hour." He turned back to the witness after asking one final question. Agent Briggs, did Representative Ocasio-Cortez ever instruct anyone to resist arrest? Briggs exhaled sharply. Calloway smiled slightly, but not explicitly. How bad was it? AOC asked Calloway as the room began to empty. Let's just say they took the first swing but were still standing, she whispered, and Calloway grinned. Across the room, Karoline Leavitt whispered to Bondi. We need to hit harder. Bondi nodded, her eyes locked on AOC. Oh, we will. But this was just the beginning. The courtroom doors opened as recess ended, and the tension in the air was even heavier than before. Pam Bondi, now more determined, got up and turned to the judge when the prosecution called our next witness, Officer Michael Reynolds. A uniformed officer stepped forward, took the oath, and sat down. His expression was firm, and he was prepared to give a testimony that could tip the scales. Bondi approached the stand. And Officer Reynolds, could you explain your role in enforcing immigration laws? Reynolds nodded. I work with local law enforcement on federal immigration detainment efforts. Our job is to locate and apprehend individuals under deportation orders. Were there instances where AOC's statements directly impacted your operations? Reynolds asked, then turned back to Bondi. Yes, several. She stepped forward. Tell the jury about one specific case. Last October, we received intelligence about a group of undocumented individuals hiding in an apartment complex. When we arrived, we found a crowd of people blocking our access. Many of them were citing statements directly from Representative Ocasio-Cortez's webinar. They refused to comply, stating that we had no legal right to detain anyone without a signed judicial warrant. Folding her arms, Bondi asked, And did you have such a warrant? No, Reynolds acknowledged. It was an administrative removal. Order. Bondi nodded. And what happened next? Reynolds tightened his hold on the witness stand. We tried to defuse the situation, but the resistance increased. By the time we got through, the targets had vanished. It was obvious they had been tipped off. A murmur echoed through the courtroom, and Bondi turned to the jury. In your professional opinion, Officer Reynolds, did Representative... Yes, Reynolds said firmly. Her statements and materials embolden resistance by portraying law enforcement as oppressors rather than protectors. Bondi nodded, no more questions. Calloway stood buttoning his jacket as he approached. His voice was steady. Officer Reynolds, you said your team didn't have a judicial warrant, correct? Reynolds hesitated. Correct. Calloway tilted his head. So you expected people to voluntarily comply with a removal order that lacked the legal authority of a judge's signature? Reynolds frowned. It was still a lawful order. Calloway turned to the jury. Lawful in the eyes of ICE. Not in the eyes of the Constitution. Reynolds told him, Are these people violent? Did they attack your officers? Reynolds shifted. No, they stood their ground, but they didn't start any violence. Reynolds paused, realizing the trap, and said, Yes. Calloway stepped back. Are you aware that legal aid organizations have been distributing Know Your Rights pamphlets for years? Were they ever accused of obstruction? Reynolds sighed. But when Representative Ocasio-Cortez does the same thing, it suddenly becomes a crime. Reynolds looked at Bondi, but she remained silent. I'm just saying her influence made things harder. For us. He turned to the jury. Bondi clenched her jaw as Reynolds stepped down. She had more evidence, but Calloway had just reframed the story. The judge exhaled. "Prosecution, do you want to call another witness?" And Bondi said, "Yes, Your Honor." AOC's eyes narrowed as Karoline Leavitt, known for her astute media tactics, entered the witness stand. Leavitt took her oath and sat down. Bondi wasted no time. Miss Leavitt leaned forward, massive. Her words don't just reach thousands, they reach millions. She's a brand, and Bondi nodded, and Leavitt grinned a little. Look at social media. The moment she tweets about ICE protests, officers get doxxed, public trust in law enforcement erodes, and AOC stiffens. Bondi went on. In your experience, has Leavitt's messaging been responsible for encouraging illegal resistance? Leavitt nodded. Yes, absolutely. She crafts her statements in a way that shields her legally, but sends a clear message to her audience. Resist obstruct. Don't comply. Bondi turned to the jury and Calloway rose, adjusted his tie. You claim my client crafts her words carefully, Bondi said. Would you say you do the same in your media appearances? Leavitt smirked. Of course, that's my job. Calloway nodded. So when you go on national television and call my client a criminal mastermind, that's also a crafted statement. Leavitt's smirk faded a little bit. It's an opinion. Calloway stepped forward. Miss Leavitt, isn't it true that you have personally profited from spreading anti-AOC narratives? Leavitt nodded. And controversy drives ratings, correct? Leavitt hesitated. Sometimes Calloway turned to the jury. Ladies and gentlemen, you just heard from a media strategist whose job it is to shape public opinion. Opinion is not fact, and opinion does not belong in this courtroom. He turned back to Leavitt. Bondi exhaled while watching. We need to go harder, Bondi whispered to Leavitt as the courtroom was empty. Don't worry, Leavitt smirked. By tomorrow, half the country will believe she's guilty before the jury even decides. The battle was intensifying as Leavitt stepped down. The prosecution had landed punches, but Calloway had countered everyone. The judge looked at the clock and said, We'll adjourn for the day. Court resumes tomorrow. AOC sat with Calloway across the room from him. They're not just trying to win the trial, she muttered. Calloway nodded. Then we'd better be ready. The courtroom was packed again the following morning. The tension had only increased during the night as media outlets analyzed every word from the previous day's proceedings. Outside, protesters clashed. Their chants reverberated through the streets. Inside Alexandria, Ocasio-Cortez sat still, her fingers lightly tapping the table as she prepared for what was about to happen. Judge Whitaker rapped his gavel, saying, Court is now in session, prosecution, you may continue. Pam Bondi stood, her face more serious than ever. Your Honor, the government calls Mark Harris, a former employee from Representative Ocasio-Cortez's office. AOC's posture stiffened slightly as the murmur permeated the courtroom. She knew Harris well. He had worked on immigration outreach for a short time before abruptly resigning. Now that she was about to learn why Harris took the stand, Bondi approached Mr. Harris. Bondi asked, Can you describe your role in Representative Ocasio-Cortez's office? Harris cleared his throat. I assisted in organizing community outreach events, particularly those focused on immigration rights. Bondi nodded. Did you ever feel that the messaging around these events crossed a legal boundary during your time there? Harris hesitated. His gaze flicked toward AOC. At times, I felt like we were walking a fine line. Bondi's eyes gleamed as she explained. We weren't just educating people about. There were meetings where we discussed ways to prevent law enforcement from detaining undocumented people. The courtroom was filled with whispers. Bondi gave his words time to settle before continuing. In your professional opinion, was this legal guidance or was this obstruction? Harris hesitated before responding. Bondi turned to the jury. No more. Questions were asked. AOC's attorney James Calloway rose slowly, his expression unreadable, and stepped toward the stand, maintaining his composure. Mr. Harris, let's be clear. You mentioned that you worked on immigration outreach during your time in AOC's office. Yes, Calloway nodded. Did Representative Ocasio-Cortez ever tell anyone to lie to the law? Enforcement. Harris shook his head. No. Calloway moved closer. Did she ever tell anyone to use false identities? No. Calloway spread his hands. So when you say it felt like obstruction, you're basing that solely on perception and not on any explicit, illegal instruction from my client. Harris shifted in his seat, I suppose so. Calloway nodded. One final question. You resigned from AOC's office, right? Yes. Was that before or after you received an offer from a conservative policy group? Silence. Harris's face palled. Relevance. Judge Whitaker looked at Calloway. Where are you going with this counselor? Calloway folded his hands. Your Honor, the jury has the right to know if this witness has a financial or political motive, for Judge Whitaker looked between the lawyers as the courtroom emptied. Karoline Leavitt leaned toward Bondi and said, We need something bigger. Bondi exhaled and said, We'll get it. Across the room, AOC turned to Calloway. They're throwing everything they have. Good, that means they're worried. I'll allow it for a moment. Answer the question, Mr. Harris. Harris shifted uncomfortably. When Calloway turned to the jury, there were no more questions. Pam Bondi was about to give them one, but they needed a decisive moment. She stood her ground, and the prosecution called Officer Luis Mendoza. A uniformed officer stepped up to the witness stand, his face unreadable. Bondi approached Officer Mendoza, who said, You were involved in an ICE operation that failed due to the interference of activists using Representative Ocasio-Cortez's materials. Bondi nodded. We had intelligence that a high-priority individual was at a residence. When we arrived, the neighborhood was already on alert, and people had formed a human blockade around the property, yelling that we had no right to be there. Bondi paced a little. And what did they cite? Mendoza exhaled. They were reading straight from AOC's Know Your Rights pamphlet that they should not open doors or answer questions. And what was the outcome? Bondi asked the jury. And what was the outcome? Mendoza's jaw tightened. By the time we got access, the target had left. A few gasps sounded throughout the courtroom, and Bondi's tone was sharp. To be clear, AOC's materials did more than just educate people. They directly led to the escape of a federal fugitive. Yes, Mendoza confirmed. Bondi let the moment linger before returning to her seat. No more questions. Calloway rose, adjusting his tie. Officer Mendoza, you said the community blocked your access. Yes, Calloway nodded. Did they attack you? No. Calloway tilted his head. Did Representative Ocasio-Cortez personally tell them to block ICE? Mendoza hesitated, not directly, but then he stepped closer. Then he asked the jury, Are you blaming my client for people exercising their rights? Bondi's lips pressed into a thin line. He let the words linger before backing off. No more questions. Bondi turned to Karoline Leavitt, who simply nodded. Tomorrow they will drop the real bombshell. The courtroom was buzzing with anticipation the following day. The tension was evident after the dramatic testimony the day before. Move forward with her plan, and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez was preparing for what was about to happen. The AOCC team had been tense, and their usual confidence was gradually beginning to crumble under the pressure. The situation was becoming personal. This was no longer just a political battle. It was a personal one. Judge Whitaker entered the room, bringing a hush to the packed courtroom. He took a seat and rapped his gavel. The prosecution's next witness, Frank Williams, a former ICE agent, was called by the prosecution. The room fell silent as Williams entered the witness stand. Williams was a commanding figure, tall and broad-shouldered, and he was wearing his bondi, wasted no time, and proceeded. Agent Williams Bondi asked, Can you describe the impact of Representative Ocasio-Cortez's actions on ICE operations? Williams didn't hesitate. Since the materials from her office were made public, we've seen a significant increase in resistance, not only in the form of protests, but also in the way people are actively evading arrest. It's become more difficult to find and apprehend individuals with outstanding removal orders. Bondi nodded, looking at the jury. How directly do you attribute this resistance to Representative Ocasio-Cortez's actions? Her materials and public statements reassured people. Bondi turned to the jury and asked if he could give any specific examples of these effects. Williams nodded. In one case, we tried to arrest a known gang member who had an active removal order, but when we got there, a crowd gathered, holding signs, chanting, and openly reading from Ocasio-Cortez's Know Your Rights materials. We were forced to abandon the operation, and a silence fell over the room as Bondi allowed the words to sink in. Would you say that Representative Ocasio-Cortez's materials directly led to a fugitive's escape? Williams nodded, and Bondi turned back to the jury. No more questions were asked. AOC's lawyer, James Calloway, got up from his chair. He was ready. Agent Williams Calloway said, "You just said that you were forced to abandon an operation, but you didn't have a judicial warrant. Did you?" Williams' eyes narrowed. "No, it was an administrative order." Calloway stepped closer. "Isn't it true that people have the right to refuse law enforcement entry into their homes without a judicial warrant?" Williams shifted uneasily. "Yes, but that doesn't mean it's legal to obstruct law enforcement in carrying out our duties." Calloway nodded. He turned back to Williams, saying, "Ladies and gentlemen, when we talk about rights, we're not talking about breaking the law. We're talking about exercising the very protections that make this country free." "Did Representative Ocasio-Cortez ever tell people to break the law?" "No," he said. "But when she distributed her materials, was she advocating for anyone to break the law?" "No, but she wasn't telling them to break the law," he said. "And isn't that the crux of this case?" "I suppose," he said before turning to the jury. Bondi clenched her jaw as Williams stepped down, frustrated. She needed to finish this as soon as possible, but Calloway was eroding the foundation one question at a time. The judge rapped his gavel, saying, "We'll take a break for lunch, and the court will meet again in an hour." AOC turned to Calloway, saying in a low voice, "That was too close. We can't keep letting them chip away at the narrative." Calloway leaned back in his chair, smiling slightly, saying, "We're still ahead. Trust me." Bondi sat with Karoline Leavitt. Across the room, they were becoming too comfortable, so we need to hit them harder. Leavitt leaned forward with a calculating look in her eyes, and Bondi nodded. "Good. Make it happen." AOC was aware that the momentum was slipping. Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez sat at the defendant's table, her face calm, but anyone who looked closely could see the exhaustion in her eyes. She had fought tooth and nail, but the battle was coming to an end. The odds were stacked against her, and the reality of what was ahead weighed heavily on her shoulders. This wasn't just about winning or losing, it was about her career, her future, and the integrity of everything she had fought for. Pam Bondi stood with quiet confidence. She had spent the last week relentlessly pressing her case, and now the moment was almost here. Judge Whitaker came in, his stern face unreadable as he tapped his gavel. "Court is now in session. Prosecution. You may call your final witness." Bondi stood her ground and spoke clearly. "Your Honor, the prosecution calls Dr. Richard Fox, an expert in immigration policy and law enforcement." A murmur went through the room as Dr. Fox, a tall man in his mid-50s with graying hair and glasses, took the oath, and Bondi wasted no time. "Dr. Fox, you've reviewed the materials distributed by Representative Ocasio-Cortez's office. What is your? When people are given information that encourages them to evade law enforcement, it undermines the authority of federal officers. It creates an environment of resistance that not only makes enforcement more difficult, but can also embolden individuals to avoid arrest even when they are under legal orders for removal." Bondi leaned forward and asked, "Do you think that these materials advocate for people to actively avoid law enforcement and resist detention despite the fact that they may be framed as legal advice?" Bondi nodded. "Cross the line between legal education and obstruction, Dr. Fox confirmed that they actively advise people on how to get around the law. Bondi turned to the jury, her tone unwavering, and there were no more questions. AOC's lawyer, James Calloway, stood slowly, adjusting his glasses. He had been waiting for this moment, and now it was time to mount a defense. Dr. Fox Calloway started by saying that the materials encouraged people to elude law enforcement. Did Representative Ocasio-Cortez personally instruct anyone to resist, arrest, or obstruct federal officers? No, she didn't personally instruct anyone to resist. Calloway persisted. Correct, Dr. Fox shifted in his seat. I would argue that the materials, when combined with the political environment, strongly encourage people to defy authority. However, Calloway interrupted, they don't explicitly advocate for illegal activity. Do they? Dr. Fox opened his mouth to speak, but Calloway denied him the opportunity. I think we can both agree, Dr. Fox, that teaching people about their rights is not a criminal offense. It is a fundamental part of the American legal system. The right to remain silent and the right not to comply without a judicial warrant are both parts of the system that protects our freedoms. He turned to the jury. What we're talking about here is not incitement to criminal activity, but rather the exercise of constitutional rights if we start. Calloway's words hung in the air as he turned back to Dr. Fox. No more questions. Bondi clenched her jaw, but she didn't respond. This was the game she had been playing all along, the battle for public perception. We will recess for lunch. Court will reconvene in 1 hour. AOC took a deep breath, her hands resting on the table in front of her. She felt the weight of the room bearing down on her. She had fought hard to keep control of her narrative, but now it felt like she was losing her grip. Across the room, Bondi and Leavitt had a quiet conversation. It was obvious they were getting ready for their final blow. The media had already started to spin the tale, with headlines portraying AOC as a radical lawbreaker. The tide was turning, and Bondi knew this was the moment she had been waiting for. When the court reconvened, the air was charged with anticipation. Bondi stood, her voice steadfast, and her heart skipped a beat when the prosecution called our final witness, Tom Haman, the former acting director of ICE. Haman had been a shadow over the trial from the start, and his testimony would be the final blow Homan delivered. Homan's voice was strong and unwavering, and her actions have directly undermined our efforts. When she publicly encourages people to resist ICE, it sends a dangerous message that makes people think they can break the law without consequences. Bondi's eyes never left AOC as she turned back to the jury. Bondi began, Mr. Haman, with the confidence of a man who had already won. His presence commanding the room, he took the oath, and he kept his gaze fixed on AOC. The courtroom fell silent as the judge prepared to deliver the verdict. After days of intense testimony, the fate of Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez hung in the balance. The jury deliberated, and finally the gavel slammed, guilty of obstruction of justice. The judge declared that AOC was guilty of actively obstructing federal law enforcement, which is a crime. A few gasps echoed in the courtroom. The final blow had been delivered, and Bondi smiled, her gaze never leaving AOC. The victory was complete, but the war for public opinion was just getting started. Stories like this remind us of the power of truth and resilience. If you enjoyed this one, make sure to subscribe for more compelling narratives. Don't forget to like, share, and drop your thoughts in the comments. We'd love to hear what you think.